This is the pearl of New Year's Eve, the oyster. Eaten alive, with a zest of lemon, it's an oceanic concentrate of French gastronomy.
It increases appetite. An oyster is always pleasant. You always feel like eating oysters.
50% of oyster production is eaten during the last 15 days of the year.
Oysters are synonymous with Christmas, New Year's Eve, New Year's. I don't think it's possible to celebrate New Year's without oysters.
It's the last animal that we eat alive, 100% natural. The French are the biggest consumers of oysters on the planet. They eat 4 pounds per person a year. And just like for wine, they are referred to by cru, by their terroir or regional flavor. They say there are as many oysters as there are oyster farmers.
They're smooth. They caress the palate.
The French appreciate this diversity. They are the raw oyster consumption world champions. But do today's experts really know what's on their plate? Because over the past years, the Triploid oyster has become a regular presence in the fishmonger's selection.
These are the Formula One of oysters.
You've most certainly eaten them without even knowing it. They represent half of France's oyster production. They are called the Triploids, the oyster of the future, and they're created in highly controlled hatcheries. And maybe it's just coincidence, but since their introduction in 2008, the oyster farming profession has experienced the worst oyster mortality rates since the 1960s. Have triploids poisoned the profession? Some oyster farmers are loudly making this claim.
Do you have to sell your soul to the devil? I don't think so.
Will this be the final New Year's Eve for the oyster? In the past, most oysters were born here, in the Arcachon Bay. Spermatozoids and ovules found each other in the ocean currents, and then oyster larvae formed. Then, just like farmers taking their livestock to the finer pastures, oyster farmers took their baby oysters to be raised in their preferred region. Here in colder, richer waters, the shell would grow larger more rapidly. Oysters are raised in Normandy, Brittany. A few years ago, Ireland became a site, and now Portugal and Morocco are farming them too. After a growing period, the oysters became French again and are sold as such. But that was before. Before the carnage of 2008, when the oysters died before they could be eaten. Since 1860, the Belloc family has been raising oysters in the Arcachon Bay. Bad years, they've had their share. But this one could become fatal. Denis carries on this 5-generation family tradition. He's become one of the region's largest oyster producers. As he inspects his oyster park in Cap Ferret, in his oyster pouches over and over, he finds the same thing.
These are the oysters I purchased in Normandy. They are pretty. They're cute. Round. A well-rounded oyster. This is an oyster made with love. This one as well. But their life expectancy is a bit shorter than the others. There is a bacteria attacking them, most importantly, which makes them more fragile. As soon as there's a change in the salinity, or a rise or decrease in temperature, they die. Since 2008, we experienced the first virus which decimated the babies, the spats, the juveniles. For the last 2 years, a bacteria has been added to the threat. This double threat does not bode well for them.
On the sorting belt, Denis counts and recounts the survivors, but the count is not good. 70% of his 3-year-old oysters, the crop that's normally now ready for sale, are dead.
This is all we do, bring up shell after shell after shell. This is not a rumor. Here, look, this one is dead. This one's dead, this one here too. So there are too many shells compared to this many oysters. We're looking at roughly half of them dead. That's 3 years of work down in the garbage. This one is unsellable. And so is this one. And this one. No need to call the coroner in to see that they're dead and gone. Quite simply, our livelihood itself is in danger. This is no longer a moral question. We really wonder, what are we going to do in the months and years to come?
Denis Belloq's case is far from being unique. Every one of France's oyster parks is now affected. Arcachon, Marennes, Oléron, as well as Normandy, Brittany, and also the basin of Thau. All of France's oyster farming basins are in danger, $60 million net of losses in 2013. What could have changed the environment and triggered such a mass death? Why are oysters now succumbing to a mysterious killer? And what if the problem is that oysters are becoming too fragile to survive? In an attempt to trace the origins of this contagion, we have come to the Ephemer Institute in the heart of the basin of Marennes-Oléron. Ephemer is the French Institute for Research in Oceanic Agricultural Activities. This public agency is administered by the Ministry of Ecology and Agriculture. Tristan Renaud is Ephemer's Chief of Health Unit in the area of mollusk microbiology.
We're going to open an oyster to take a sample, which we will preserve in a fixative, which will enable us to perform what we call a histology, where we look for different types of infectious agents, such as viruses, bacteria, and parasites. In animals under a year old, at the spat level of maturity, mortality levels are due to a virus, OSHV1, which stands for Ostrich herpes virus 1. For older animals, the ones which are on an average of 3 years of age, we also see death rates, but they are linked to a bacteria called Vibrio estuarianus.
Using an electronic microscope, the virus becomes visible throughout the oyster.
As you can see, the nucleus of this infected cell is like a factory for reproducing the virus. There's a swarm of them infesting it.
A virus that's associated with a bacteria, which is decimating oysters and infesting the milieu.
We've been able to establish that an oyster was capable of re-releasing several million viral particles in the water around it. These viruses can then contaminate the oysters around the infected oyster. So contamination can occur very quickly. Globally, one can ask questions concerning aspects of global change. What impact could the environment have upon these mortality rates? There are no answers for the moment, only questions.
For Tristan Renaud, rising mortality rates may be linked to climate change and a rapid degradation of water quality. This may be so, but for others, like François Samin, the problem lies elsewhere. A now retired Ephemer researcher, he is convinced of a link between the high mortality rate in 2008 and the massive arrival at that time of a new type of oyster, the Triploid. This man-made animal is born in a laboratory. It's at the limit of genetic manipulation, But in this case, it's not the genes, but the chromosomes that are manipulated. These oysters are sterile. They grow more rapidly. For an ocean-raised oyster, 3 years to maturity instead of 4. But maybe they were introduced onto the market too early.
In medicine, for example, we're ones mainly interested in these ailments. When we do research that results in new treatment procedures, the treatment process itself is a bit lengthy because it can be implemented in the field, meaning to be validated. What I've noticed is that it is now 2014 in this situation, that is to say, the implementation of these types of triploids in the field has still not been done despite previous validation.
Did the ephemer scientists rush the oyster onto the market? It's true that competition from other countries was fierce. It all began in the United States in the 1980s, in southern New York State, in the Chesapeake Bay to be precise. In the last century, Americans produced 600,000 tons of oysters. And then the apocalypse came. Because of a virus, the oysters disappeared. It's thanks to Stan Allen that oyster farming was reborn in the Bay. Stan is a geneticist. He created a company dedicated to oyster breeding and reproduction. He created an oyster hatchery.
I think we need to move out of the old ideas that we'll use a natural seed and we'll transport it to areas where there's high disease and they'll die, to one of using improved varieties, whether it's a disease-resistant stock that we've developed from native oysters, or whether it's a non-native oyster that is already disease-resistant. We need to move into the artificial cultivation of oysters so that harvests aren't dependent upon natural processes like recruitment of the oysters. We can do that through hatcheries.
In his laboratory, Stan Allen's goal is to go beyond selecting and improving existing oyster varieties. He creates a patent on a totally new oyster race, the famous Triploid. Oyster farming comes back to the Bay. At the same time, 5,000 miles away, in France, André Girard is working on the oyster of the future. He's in the process of inventing another version of the Triploid. At first, the French are having a difficult time. Their tests are not yielding good results.
The first stage of the creation of these triploid oysters occurred between 1990 and 1997. It was a chemical stage, that is to say that the induction of the triploidy was performed with each generation. We took female oysters and induced triploidy with a chemical poison.
A chemical poison. This method, used in 1997, is finally abandoned. The product they were using was a carcinogen. In 2008, ephemer researchers perfect a new method for creating a triploid oyster. They will also patent their new method. It consists of crossing a diploid oyster with 2 chromosomes with a 4-chromosome oyster called a tetraploid. The new race born of the crossing is the triploid, and it has 3 chromosomes. This sterile oyster grows faster than other oysters, but it also seems to be more fragile.
Let's not forget, regarding the events which occurred in 2008, there were these changes in the patent, as well as changes in the technology. One wonders if there weren't steps which have been taken a bit quickly, without due precautions, and what might be the potential impact on the animal, its survival, and its fragility regarding pathogens.
This ephemer researcher notices that the tetraploid oysters used to create the triploids can't survive in nature.
When raising oysters in a hatchery, we get rid of the quedlos, the ones which are the smallest. So to be exact, they were able to filter these tetraploid larvae because they are smaller than the diploids and the triploids.
And were these the ones which were preserved?
Those were the ones we kept, that we raised, and a portion of the tetraploids which were provided to the profession emerged from this technology.
These oysters, with a weak genetic makeup, are thus used to create the French triploids. There is only one place where you can buy these oysters. It's at Ephemer. They are the only organization allowed to raise and sell triploids. We meet with Tristan Renaud in a specialized laboratory at Ephemer.
In this room, we have several vats. All of the vats are used for the production of tetraploids. This is what a tetraploid oyster looks like. They cannot be differentiated from diploid oysters. And these animals in particular are produced to be, in some cases, sent to commercial hatcheries.
Oysters under strict surveillance. They wear badges and have electronic markers. They are to be used one time only to create triploids.
Each animal which is sent to a hatchery is identified in this manner, and professionals need to return either the shells or the animals to us. So when we receive them, we identify them and verify that these are definitely the animals which were originally sent out. Simply put, we do this so that the professionals do not keep living tetraploid animals in their installations, because they're capable of reproducing.
These are dangerous oysters, because if just one tetraploid were to make its way into nature, in just a few years, it could sterilize all of the wild oysters. These super oysters are sold for $2,250 apiece. They're sold to hatcheries to breed triploids. Eric Marisal runs one of the largest hatcheries in France, and he is now in the process of creating his triploids.
In each of the two vats that we will be emptying today, we have 250 million larvae swimming about, which we are going to bring to the metamorphosis room. These larvae are like little black dots. Oyster larvae measure about 0.2 millimeters. Yes, these are the larvae of triploid oysters. In each pot, we have 20 million little larvae, so there are 5,000 tons of potential oysters in this tiny basin.
5,000 tons of oysters, which is over half of the Bay of Arcachon's yearly production. To achieve this result, Eric Marisal invested in a highly sophisticated production facility, and he is not shy about defending his production methods.
We use antibiotics. When raising larvae, there are 3 precise periods during which we will use an antibiotic for a day. Anyone who says they don't use antibiotics while raising oysters is a charlatan or a liar, or a very bad oyster farmer who makes products of very bad quality.
According to him, antibiotics are an essential tool in the breeding process.
When it's a matter of mass production, wild animals and wild plants are ineffectual. Everything is domesticated.
In Eric Marisal's facility, genetic selection is used at every stage to get to an ideal domesticated oyster. For him, it is the only way to raise an oyster that can withstand the mortality crisis.
These are diseases caused by man-made farming. These are not illnesses originating in the wild species. That is what people do not understand. When you raise wild oysters, you are up against an impressive amount of diseases that they carry with them, which are important illnesses for maintaining natural balances. They are an invasive species. When you want to raise them and you begin with wild specimens, at some point, no matter what technique you use, from the moment they repeat, you will have 1 or 2 diseases which, in these contexts, will begin killing them off, and you will end up with an oyster farm which will undergo an epidemic. This is what is currently happening.
Those in the hatchery business think that a choice must be made between wild oysters and laboratory-raised oysters. Between the two, cohabitation in nature seems to be nearly impossible. Stéphane Angerie is the director of France Naissant, one of the world leaders in oyster breeding. The number of nurseries has continually grown over the past 20 years. There are now about 20 hatcheries in France. Stéphane Angery is also the president of their association. Oyster farmers have been battling with them since as far back as 2008. The hatcheries are accused of having propagated disease among wild oysters with the distribution of their Triploid product.
C'est absolument pas fondé.
This is absolutely unfounded, totally unsubstantiated. Currently, that cannot be said because there is nothing that proves any of it. Today, all species, whether animal or vegetal, have diseases. That's how it is. It's even what causes species to evolve.
C'est ce qui fait même évoluer les espèces. Aujourd'hui, on a des maladies.
Today, there are diseases all the time. And saying that all the problems of oyster farming are a product of hatcheries, and notably that the triploid is to blame, is completely baseless. And that is completely the wrong end of the stick.
And yet, this profession that works with living organisms is neither very regulated nor controlled. Just about anyone who can afford it can set up a shop as an oyster breeder. This is what Gérald Viau, president of the CNC, the National Center for Conchiliculture, informs us.
What I regret in the story of these triploids is that this product was introduced without any follow-up or real monitoring to check either its negative or positive effects. There should have been monitoring, and there wasn't. Since hatcheries today are not legislatively regulated or checked. In all the delivery establishments, for example, you have vets which inspect, like the DDTM. You have the DDCCRF, which oversees all the government services have their fingers in it, as it should be. But regarding the hatchery, well, if I want to set one up tomorrow, there is no regulation. I can just do it. Anyone can start up a hatchery.
And when we do put the question to the fishing delegation of the Ministry of Environment, they prefer not to answer, as the subject is too sensitive. Should we fear the triploid? To find out more, we traveled to Ireland, the new El Dorado for oyster farmers and the paradise for triploids. Even though the Irish rarely eat oysters, they are now producing them in partnership with French professionals. Ireland has become the second largest European oyster producer. About 10 years ago, Nicolas Tessier left his native region of Marennes-Oléron to start up a hatchery here, near Galway. This morning, he's en route to his hatchery. He's going to the International Oyster Festival.
Are you ready for the second heat?
They will be crowning the world champion oyster opener.
3, 2, and go! This is really...
Paulie, we've 24 from Ireland. Our Irish champion has 24.
24 for
Ireland.
20.
16 for Finland.
29 for Denmark.
Final oyster for Denmark.
Nicolas, son and grandson of oyster farmers in Marennes-Oléron, 5 generations, and yet he doesn't like eating oysters, and neither does his wife.
I love farming oysters, but I don't eat them. I can manage to eat them cooked, but...
Nicolas can't stay for long at the festival. Back at the hatchery, a truck has arrived with an order of spats, and he has to get them in the water as fast as possible.
This is a spat, which has arrived from France, from our main suppliers. All the hatcheries are in France. These are baby oysters, which are only a few months old, between 2 and 4 months.
You have to really want to live in Ireland. 260 rainy days a year. The rest of the time, it's pretty much gray with scattered sunshine.
Today is a nice day, but most of the time it's wind and rain day in and day out. The climate can be depressing at times. But it's also easy because for oyster farming here, it's a paradise. Here we work around 20 hectares of oyster parks with around 20 million spats per year.
Acres and acres of oyster park, open to the ocean, with millions of triploids.
We essentially make triploid in the parks here. It's about 70 to 80% triploid. Above all, we respond to market demand. They ask me for triploid, so that's what I farm. It's been 2 years, 2 summers in a row, where we've had relatively good growth because we've had the climate which encourages it. Beyond that, we have no control. It's Mother Nature who runs things. Each year follows, and none is the same.
Plus, you have a very low mortality rate, right?
Yes, very little mortality. None, so to speak. On certain lots, we have some mortality, others none.
Nicolas explains that this fortunate situation is due to the cold water and low density of oyster parks.
Here we're going it alone. There's no one else. Our first neighbor opposite is 5 kilometers away. Zones like this where there's no one don't exist. You can't find this in France. It's all over. All over. Okay, shall we head out?
Today, Nicolas is receiving clients from Morin-Oléron who've come to examine his healthy triploids.
We're checking the weight of the grow-out bags so we have a general idea of the stock we have in the parks. We've nevertheless had strong growth. You can see when we placed them, the shell was a bit darker. They were basically like this. And here they've gotten to this point in the summer, which indicates relatively good growth.
There's no mortality, just one that's been knocked about. But no, there is no mortality. The environment is very favorable because there are no losses. Is that astonishing? Yes, it's very surprising indeed.
Is Ireland's natural environment more favorable? Certainly. But the triploid's low mortality rate can also be explained because there are no natural oysters here carrying the virus and other bacteria. Back in France, in the Gulf of Morbihan, 10,000 tons of oysters are produced here each year. Yvonnik chooses to raise his oysters the traditional way, like his father and his grandfather did before him. They are cultivated on the seafloor around Ile d'Ar. These oysters are born at sea and raised on these tubes.
These are spat. These are collectors with oysters on them. Very little ones. There's one, here's another, another, another. There are a lot. Very small. We have a spat collection in July and in August, and definitely in September.
Yvonnik decided he would raise spats born in the wild, and he'd let nature run its course. This is a courageous attitude given today's mortality rates.
We work with a 50% mortality rate on the spats, and we're happy. At 60%, we're in the average, but at 90%, we can take it for 1 year. It's hard, but we can take it. If we see an increase to 90% for several years, the oyster farm dies.
The seabed-raised oyster is the ultimate wild oyster. Hardly 1 oyster per square meter, growing on a sand and pebble bottom. Only a few producers practice this method, as loss to predation is quite high.
I still raise oysters on the bottom, though I know there's a higher predation from starfish, crabs, periwinkle, and sea bream, which eat a lot of oysters. And what about the vibrio? As for the Vibrio asterianus, it hasn't created a mortality problem for me. How is it that your oysters are not affected? Because it's a natural species, and I think nature is well conceived.
Ça, c'est superbe, ça.
This is superb. It's meaty, full-flavored. I love these oysters.
J'adore ça. Super bon. J'adore. J'adore ces huîtres. Ah, une belle
Beautiful
nacre.
nacre.
Plein de belles choses
Lots
sur
of good
l'huître.
things in the oyster. They're better than tetraploids?
Je sais pas.
Don't know. I don't eat tetraploids.
Back on his boat, Ivanik must now spread out the oysters he's collected. And elsewhere, in another zone, he'll drag up those that are ready to be sold.
Là, la drague, on la met à l'eau.
The dragger will go in the water. I'll lower it to the bottom.
La drague va tomber à l'eau, va ratisser
And
le
we'll
sol,
drag up the
et on va
oysters.
draguer les huîtres. Hop, là,
Okay,
on
we're in our
drague,
oyster park,
la drague
so
tombe à
we'll
l'eau.
lower it.
Ouais, je sais qu'elles sont
I
belles.
know they're nice.
Les huiles, là, il y a une
They
belle
grow
pousse.
very well here.
Non, non, j'ai pas de souci.
No, my oysters don't have a problem with Vibrio. My natural oysters, born at sea and raised on the bottom, have no problems. I can see that.
Non. Bon, il y a toujours
We
un
always
petit
have some empty
peu,
shells in the production cycle, but it's not caused by Vibrio,
Au Vibrio que connaissent
which is what's happening to the tetraploid producers in the summer.
le triploid l'été dès qu'ils manipulent cette huître-là.
A little under 100 oyster farmers, like Ivanik, who practice traditional methods, have come together in an association, the Natural Oyster Farmers. They promote oysters born and raised in the natural environment, and these farmers do not want to hear about triploids. During the national gathering in Vannes, the traditional oyster farmers review the court case they've started in the court of Rennes against Ifremer. They accuse the public organization to have developed a biotechnology oyster without measuring the consequences. But the combat is going to be a hard one.
If we don't put up a fight, if the future is tetraploid oysters, it's the world according to Monsanto, raising sterile oysters so there are no more natural harvests, forced to go begging to the hatcheries each year to provide us with spats that produce sterile oysters. If that is the future of my profession, then I have another set of values. I want to leave a different type of world to my children and grandchildren. So if we don't put up a fight, that's sad. It's a case of having a conscience. We have a business to run, but are we going to sell our soul to the devil? I don't think so.
If triploid oysters have caused so much disaccord, it's also because there are many who denounced Ifremer's unclear roles. At the same time, Ifremer is both the provider and the judge. Ifremer provides the male tetraploids to the hatcheries, and at the same time, its mission is to control the quality of commercial marine products. This is an untenable situation for a public organization. The next day, we meet up again with Ivanik at the Aradon Farmers Market. It's the Christmas season, and clients are eager to buy his oysters.
I took the anti-tetraploid position just to say in my boutique there are no tetraploids. I have a big proportion of my clientele that buys my oysters because I don't produce tetraploids. In France, we have a regulation that says I can't label my oysters natural oysters. We have a law like that. My oysters are born in the ocean. They grow at sea. I can label them born in the ocean. I can't be attacked for that. But the anti-fraud regulation prohibits me from using the label natural oyster. This customer is for the labeling of tetraploids on their cases. We met a week ago, and he thinks it's not normal that tetraploids are not clearly indicated to the clients. For the public at Christmas time, thousands of us will eat genetically modified oysters, and we don't know it. And there have been very few studies about the subject.
Because in this affair, there are oysters and there are oysters. Those born in hatcheries, including the triploid, and those born in the wild. But in the stores, they are sold with no distinctive marking. There's no obligation to inform the public with a label. The triploid is not considered to be a new product or a GMO, and they taste great. We're in the town of Vélizy, in one of Europe's largest fish markets. It's 2 days before New Year's Eve, the busiest time of year for oysters. Kamel, the manager of this giant seafood market, is hard at work.
Load more shrimp for me there. Load more.
He pays attention to every small detail,
Can you straighten the price label? That one's falling.
because the biggest proportion of his annual sales will occur during the last 15 days of the year, when 40 tons of oysters will be sold for over $280,000. But does the average customer really know what he's buying? Not always.
This is number 3.
Okay,
That's the number 2.
okay. The 2 is more milky than the 3?
Milky? You said milky?
Yes?
That's only in the summertime, sir. You're maybe mixing up meaty with milky.
Meaty or milky? Number 2 or number 3? Normandy or Arcachon? Triploid or wild? It's impossible for the customer to figure out.
I don't know these. Maybe these are the ones on display. What's this mean? They have a gold medal.
These are flat with a gold medal 2014.
And so? There's a dozen?
About 1 dozen ballons.
Are these ballons?
They're ballons. You have the sanitary label here, and it shows the date they were packaged. The packaging date is very important. Why? Because it tells you when you can eat the oysters. The label always tells you the first 3 days following the packaging date. We call these first 3 days the saline flavor days because the oysters will still be filled with the seawater. And when you eat them, you will taste the flavor of the seawater and taste their freshness. An oyster is still good from the 4th day to the 9th day. We call these days the top flavor days. The oyster is the best then because it will have regenerated its own water inside. The oysters are excellent then. After day 9, you should check and verify if they're still alive. That's important.
These look pretty good.
For your average customer, they all look alike. Yet some people can find differences. How to identify an oyster through its flavor? That's the job of Bruno Gauvin, finest craftsman in France in fish and shellfish opening.
Today we're going to study how to open oysters, then a tasting.
Bruno gives an oyster class each week here on Rue Le Pic in Paris. But before tasting it, you must know how to open the oyster.
We are going to avoid using knives with the metal guard on them. Throw them in the garbage. They're of no use. They have a little metal guard. There is a specific way to hold your knife. We're going to hold it near the blade, far away from the handle, and closer to the point. And we aren't going to use a towel. The towel reduces dexterity and hinders your movement. Our goal is to find and cut the tendon. The tendon is located at about 2/3. First third, second third, and it's my left hand that does the work. My right hand is not forcing anything, and I'm going to touch the tendon here, and now I feel it release. And at this point, I place my left thumb like this, and it holds the oyster open. I don't move the knife too much, or else I'll break the oyster shell. And now, normally, my oyster's open.
I'm supposed to put it here.
Approximately.
It's not easy to do. Fantastic! I opened an oyster. I'll come to your house, Sabine, because I can't do it.
There, that's great. Move it about and push through.
Tonight I'm going to tease my man and tell him that I can open oysters too now. It's great. We'll just eat oysters between us ladies. We don't need the men anymore. It'll be better.
I think it really caresses the palate.
Between the salty and the sweet that you taste, then it's soft to chew. It's a delicious velour, chilly and fresh, going down your throat. And that's incredible.
It's like a wine. It depends on the year. There are crus, and that's extraordinary. There are 7 terroirs, 7 regions or terroirs, and they each give their unique flavor. But it's not frozen in time. That's what's extraordinary. And the oyster farmers are always working on their products and improving them. An oyster is happiness concentrated inside a little shell.
But if we mention the triploid, there's a little unease. I've never really looked into that subject, and I don't know what consequences it could have on what product I like to eat.
That's not the subject of the class.
Yeah, that's it.
Today we're here to learn to open the oyster and to taste them.
What did you eat today? Do you know?
No, we don't know, but we have complete confidence in our oyster farmers.
A few hundred yards away, Florent, who produces oysters in the Mediterranean, brings his products to Guy Savoy, a 3-star chef. With him is his daughter Florie. They'll be presenting their 2014 harvest, the Tarborièche Specials, top-of-the-line triploids. They are among the highest-priced oysters in France, $6 a piece.
Let's see what's inside here.
Always that beautiful nacre.
A little white, nice and white.
Yes, white and a little pink.
It's beautiful, huh? The big muscle, always the same. And the taste, it's the chef who decides.
You have all of the flavors here. And the muscle. When you get to the muscle flavors the oyster. Beyond the consistency, we're really in what we imagine a protein to be. You bite into it, and it's meaty. And above all, there's a complexity. But it's a complexity that's also subtle. When you look at its case, at its nacre, and also the size of the muscle, you say, this little animal has had the good life.
At first, when I started selling to this market of restaurant chefs, and it's a very demanding market, I brought the finest Bézigue oysters I knew how to produce. The prettiest oysters made, with the greatest passion, but that was not enough. The demand was above what I was able to produce. That's where I got the idea to give them an environment that was a little more complicated, more difficult to master. And the Marais Solaire was born out of that.
If Florent Tarborièche is doing so well, it's thanks to his revolutionary idea, his patented invention, which artificially reproduces the tide cycles of the Mediterranean Sea. A few days later, we meet him in his oyster park in the Tow Basin. He's with his son. His oysters hang from lines that are raised and lowered like the tides.
The nets are suspended. They're attached to these bars. The bars are powered by little motors that turn them. They rotate, they roll up, and it goes around the bar, and that lifts up the nets.
Stressed by leaving the water, the oysters will create a reserve of flesh and become meatier. This revolutionary system works on solar power and can be piloted from a smartphone.
It's true that we could just let it go on automatic, but we humans are here to observe and say the weather's good or bad, it's good or not, and each day the action we trigger, our intervention, it's decided by us humans. Above all, on top of being delicious, they're a bit chewy.
Cette mâche, c'est-à-dire
They have texture.
They have a very different texture. An oyster that grows too fast, that is rapidly making its shell, won't have this texture. And what makes our difference is also that we have this beautiful nacre. The more we vary between in the sea and in the air, forces them to create this nacre, to keep themselves waterproof. They live suspended during these long frequencies, and this makes them more beautiful, much prettier than those other varieties when they're harvested.
Thanks to his invention, Florent is now able to sell to the top-of-the-line markets like Hong Kong, China, and Russia, and his price can go up to $9 a piece. Further to the west, in the Bay of Arcachon, Denis Belloc continues to watch over his oyster park in Cap Ferret. He raises natural oysters and triploids as well.
Bon, là, il y a un peu d'espoir quand même.
There's still hope, though.
Ouais. Disons que là, les survivants...
Let's just say that the survivors are starting to reach a nice size. And if they continue like this, they'll be ready to harvest next Easter. But that's the situation now, and I'm just guessing that there will be another mortality phase, as always, in the middle of summer. So maybe we'll have some stock to sell in a few months. I hope so.
How do you see the Christmas harvest?
Christmas in December again this year. But concerning my oysters, I really can't see that far ahead. I have no idea what's going to happen. So we shall see.
Donc on verra.
So while waiting for Santa Claus, Denis has to diversify to save his business. He now sells his oysters on the terrace of his fishing cabin in the picturesque Mambo area.
Damn, the shellers have work. Help me out with 10 dozen number 3s for the boat to be delivered in 2 platters of 5s.
Denny, it's rare to see an oyster farmer with a smile like you.
These years we make the most of the little moments of joy. It's not always as good as this. You can believe that.
And when it comes to attracting more customers, Denis has no shortage of imagination. He's put a rock group on his oyster barge to entertain his customers. It's a first in the Bay of Arcachon.
Big leg woman, calling home my hand. Calling home my hand.
What we see here, is this necessary for an oyster farmer to survive these days?
To survive here in the Bay of Arcachon, you have to change careers. Today here it's become very complicated to produce oysters. Now it's the retail sales on the terrace that keep the business going. So we have to keep the terrace working. That doesn't stop us from working our oyster farm. We're still working on our oysters. They have to be pretty. Because it's nice to have this terrace business, but if our products aren't beautiful, and particularly here where the clients are very demanding, we can't make any errors. They have to be good and beautiful. It's as simple as that.
But without the terrace, you wouldn't be here today?
Without the terrace, it would be very complex. We lost 120 tons of oysters last summer. This year, we've already lost 50 tons, so it's not good.
It's super here in the cabin of Mambo. Last year, on the Bay of Arcachon, almost a third of oyster farmers opened up retail sales boutiques to save their businesses. Even if this herpes virus and the bacteria are not dangerous for humans, there is no antidote yet available. The shellfish will certainly end up by adapting to the diseases, but will the oyster farmers find a way to survive? The oyster is often called the bee of the sea. Its mortality is also highly upsetting, as it could easily be seen as an alarm sign concerning the health of the ocean. In the end, has science gone too far in its manipulation of a living species? It's more than a story of good flavor. It's a story of ethics, and the economic stakes are high. The oyster farmers want to be able to sell more oysters and all year long. The hatcheries want the same. If Fremer sells the oysters to the hatcheries that permit them to create their triploids, everyone is coming out ahead, except for Mother Nature.